Right, we started recording now, Councillor Karam, so I'll hand over to yourself. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And good morning, everyone, in this Executive Cabinet Members meeting for Highways. Let's start with item 1, which is monitoring of Executive Cabinet Member decisions enclosed. Any question on this? No, no questions. So let's move on to the second item, which is Community Housing Services Post-Education Staff Positions.
Thank you, Councillor. That's a report from my service area. So this report summarises changes to several apprentice roles across housing services. We're looking to transition into permanent positions as they achieve their relevant qualifications. The first is the addition of an adult social worker role with a specific focus on single homelessness and other adults with complex needs. This role will support work across both housing options, the rough sleeper service and the safeguarding adults team. The apprentice role itself was actually brought in during 2022, but is now approaching qualification, so we want to establish it formally within the team. There are 2 further housing standards roles. The housing standards team were affected by the departure of a number of qualified staff in a short space of time during 2023. Aside from recruitment to those vacancies that were created, which were quite challenging, we also developed 2 housing standards role apprentice roles, which were part funded by the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. Those roles essentially again are reaching a point of qualification, and we're keen to retain their services within the team, therefore establishing permanent roles for them to transition into. We've also got a part qualified technical officer role, again, which was part funded through GMCA. Funding was for a period of 2 years. While the officer went through further higher educational and professional qualification. That has now successfully concluded, and we are looking to secure their position again from a fixed term role into a permanent role within the wider team. Details of the specific roles are contained within sections 2.1 to 2.11 of this report. 2.15 to 2.20 and section 4 reflects how the roles will be funded over the long term, with a focus on long-term grant commitments and also using some of the grants that we've got quite flexibly during that time. The alternatives to this approach are detailed in section 3 and the risks associated with that. And the recommendation from the report to the executive member is to approve option 1, which is to establish the housing vulnerable adult social worker role, the 2 housing standard technical officer roles, and transition the support officer role into a permanent position from a fixed term contract. Welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mark. Any question? No question. Councillor Hewitt.
Thank you, Councillor Cramp. Just at 2.19, it just sort of said funding has been identified. I was just wondering where it was identified from and what is the interplay between sort of this demand and how it refers back. You said the grant application has been used quite flexibly. How does it relate back to sort of asylum and refugee?
About a third of our overall service demand comes from the asylum and refugee community, and so reflecting on the fact that those needs are quite wide and varied from a housing perspective, both in terms of the housing availability, the support infrastructure that's needed around them being able to sustain a tenancy, and the quality of the accommodation that they're moving into, specifically from the support that can be offered through housing standards, is all things that can be funded through that programme that we've got specific grant funding for, and that grant funding runs till at least 2028, 2029, and in all likelihood beyond, which gives us, certainly in the short to medium term, good confidence that we can afford to sustain these roles.
Just a supplementary, if that's okay. Just out of curiosity, just what government department is that?
So it's the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government.
Okay, normal, right, okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. If there's no more question, then the report is approved as recommended. Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Next item is Walker Avenue and Fairclough Street Traffic Regulation Order.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'll take this one. Unfortunately, Joe, our network manager, was intending to present this one, but I'll do it on his behalf. So there is, as you'll be aware from previous meetings, traffic regulation orders I have delegated authority as long as we don't receive any objections. And in these 2 cases, the next 2 reports, we have received objections. All traffic regulation orders are promoted and requested by the ward councillors. So the first report is for prohibition of driving on 2 streets, which came from ward councillors in relation to specific road safety issues that residents had raised in relation to speeding and vehicles driving dangerously on those 2 routes. We have received some complaints because obviously those vehicles were displaced onto other roads and other adjoining roads, and the report details all of the kind of like interaction that we've had and all the consultation that we've had with residents. So there's 3 options that we can consider here. So because we've had a lot of complaints and a lot of inquiries, particularly about imposing a prohibition of driving on Walker Street, we have an opportunity to do that under an experimental order. Now, what the experimental order means is that we'll enforce it with the traffic regulation order, but allows a further 6 months of consultation, and then we can make a decision at the end of that 6 months to either retain the prohibition of driving or remove the prohibition of driving. The prohibition of driving, the request on Fairclough Street, had less issues and was quite widely supported by residents. So there's 2 options for you to consider, Chair. We can impose the prohibition of driving on Fairclough Street, as the report states, and an experimental order on Walker Street, or we can just impose a permanent prohibition of driving on both, or obviously you've got a third option of not supporting the prohibition of driving, and that's really it. So that's the recommendations of officers, and the recommendations within the report will request that we do impose an experimental order on Walker Avenue, just to allow that further consultation, just to see how that goes for the next 6 months. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ruben. Councillor Hayes.
Thank you, Executive Member. I support what's being said about the experimental order, but presumably there will be some additional costs involved in doing that.
Probably, I mean, only in officer time dealing with inquiries. The order still goes through, so the signs will still be made up. The experimental order, actually probably legal costs. So this is why I wish Joe was on this call right now. So potentially, yeah, we probably will have to raise 2 orders. The experimental traffic regulation order, then there probably will be additional costs to make that permanent after the 6-month period. So there will be additional costs in doing this.
If we decide not to make it permanent, we'll then presumably have to remove the signs.
Yeah, at the end of the 6-month period, yeah, we will remove the signs, yeah, and it will just revert back to its present status.
I've got to say, despite that, I do support that option, because I think it's a far better way of going ahead. But I think we have to always be aware of the extra costs.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Councillor. In this, the Walker Avenue one is slightly more contentious and will impact certainly the through traffic and residents more. That's why we would quite like to monitor that for the next 6 months, just to see how that goes.
Thank you. If there is no more question, and the report is noted and approved as recommended, the option 1. Thank you. The next one is Little Lever and Darcy Lever, various sites waiting restrictions. Again, Duane. Yeah,
thank you, Chair. So again, another traffic regulation order, which is at the request of the ward councillors for Little Lever and Darcy Ward. This is quite wide-ranging across the ward, and is looking at specific road safety issues around junctions and around some through routes where we've got hazards with parked vehicles and vehicles not being able to get through safely. We have received an awful lot of inquiries and complaints about this, because as soon as you start to impose parking restrictions, it does displace vehicles onto side roads. So obviously some impacts, so residents will be affected by this, but the whole point is that they're probably parking illegally at the moment too close to junctions. They are affecting sight lines, the parking in a manner which does make it dangerous, particularly for pedestrians, blocking footways and blocking carriageways, and obviously for emergency vehicles as well. If emergency vehicles can't get through because they're double parked and the roads are obstructed. It just means that because at the moment, if an obstruction in the highway, it has to be enforced by the police. But if we put the weighting restrictions on, we can enforce on those with our own CEOs. There's an awful lot of locations or detail within the appendices and detail within the report. The consultation and all the interaction with residents is also detailed within the report, and the ward councillors remain supportive of the recommendations, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Duane. Councillor Hayes.
Yes, thank you again. Just a general comment. I see we've got the old chestnut of a residents-only parking scheme brought forward, which comes out forward a lot of times. As well as the problems mentioned in the report, I think the very few cases where we have introduced them in Bolton, the residents have very shortly asked them to be removed again. For the reasons you say, that it doesn't give people the right to park, they have to pay, and there's a lot of problems with it. So, you know, I agree again with the report, but the residents only thing is always brought up.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hayes. I can't see any other hand, so I think there's no more questions. So report is approved as recommended.
Thank you, Chair.
And that concludes our meeting.
It does.
That
Thank
concludes
you.
our meeting. Thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you very much.
Much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Chair.
Councillor.
Thank you, councillors.
Thank you.
Thank you.